Usually when a bomb beeps, it's a bad thing. Because they're about to explode.
When asked about the most influential superhero movies of all time, many often point to the Dark Knight trilogy. Batman Begins paved the way for an era of darker, grounded superhero stories, while The Dark Knight pushed the boundaries of a typical superhero movie. As for The Dark Knight Rises, well, it depends on who you ask. For many, it's just as good as the other films. You can even see this in many review sites, where Rises is often rated quite highly. But for others, it's the worst of the trilogy, and for good reason.
I couldn't help but wonder, did I need a therapist after all?
Every film in the trilogy has its flaws, and even though Rises has its strong points, it can be hard to look past many of its issues. And I say that as someone who used to love this movie. I'm not exaggerating either. I love this movie so much, I dedicated my college admissions essay to it. And while it's definitely as corny as it sounds, I actually got accepted by that very essay. Not many people have tangible, financial proof that Batman changed their life. And if anyone has Nolan's contact info, let me know, cause I got a hell of an invoice for him. But all jokes aside, I used to adore this movie, and that adoration must have come from somewhere. The Dark Knight Rises is one of the most emotionally resonant Batman films to date, and at times, this film was capable of matching, if not surpassing, every Batman movie that came before it. But as amazing as Rises can be, it's not always amazing, and your enjoyment of this movie will come down to how much it resonates with you, or how much it frustrates you. So before getting into the issues with Rises, it's important to be mindful about what those issues are. Rises always stood out to me as a film that gets a lot of critique, but truthfully, many issues with Rises were present in the other Batman films. Telling overshowing, clumsy dialogue, messy third acts. You can see examples of all that across the trilogy. And if you're going to pick apart Rises for what it does wrong, then it's only fair to critique the others just as much. But while you could easily sit back and pick apart the trilogy for hours, I also think there's a point where discussion stops being meaningful and just becomes an exercise in self-indulgence. Instead, I think the more constructive thing to do is to highlight the most relevant flaws and explore how those flaws affect the film. And to start, I personally think the biggest issue with Rises comes down to a bloated script. There's a lot going on in The Dark Knight Rises, whether it's the numerous plot threads or the combination of new and returning characters. While many aspects are crucial to the story, others aren't so much, and screen time spent on things like Daggett, Foley, or the stock exchange all take up screen time that could have been used elsewhere. As for the other main issue, it'd be regarding the film's character writing. Christopher Nolan excels at writing themes and ideas, but generally struggles with characters, to the point where his characters feel less like people and more like extensions of a theme or idea. If you want an example, well,
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
And this isn't to say all of Nolan's character writing is weak, and you can see examples of stronger writing in other films, as well as the Batman trilogy itself. This film was interesting in that it has some of Nolan's best character writing to date, and at the same time, the same weak writing he's known for. While bloat and weak characters were seen in the other films to various degrees, they're magnified even more in Rises, and that makes it hard to appreciate the film's strong points. Rises has some of the highest highs in the trilogy, but many, many lows, and that roller coaster of quality isn't for everyone. As for the film itself, The Dark Knight Rises takes place 8 years after the events of The Dark Knight, and right away, we can see some issues. Now, the time skip in Rises is something I've touched on before, because it's partially an homage to The Dark Knight Returns. But to keep things on pace, the gist of the issues lie in how the time skip doesn't add much to the film, at least not to the extent you think it would. Nolan chose to use the time skip to show how the ending of The Dark Knight meant something, but instead of feeling like a narrative tool, the time skip feels like a narrative shortcut, where it's basically used to get the characters and story to where they need to be. The time skip is a good idea on paper, and you can see great examples in other Batman stories, but the way it's handled here is a bit underwhelming, and if anything, the time skip adds more negatives than positives. Because of the 8-year time skip, much of the first act is spent establishing the status quo, as well as establishing new characters and plot threads. The heavy exposition makes the first act feel slow, and not always in a good way. But the slower paced first act works in some areas, especially with regards to the Dark Knight himself. The Bruce Wayne we see in Rises is a shadow of his former self, and he's hung up his cape due to a combination of grief and the belief that Gotham no longer needs Batman. And in my opinion, this film's portrayal of Bruce is easily one of its strongest aspects. The Dark Knight Rises is first and foremost a Batman-centered movie, and while that sounds like a no-brainer given the title, Batman actually hasn't been a main focus for about 1.5 movies so far. Batman Begins as a fantastic origin story, but Bruce finishes most of his development by the end of the first act. And with The Dark Knight, Bruce doesn't develop as much, and he doesn't so much as change, but his initial beliefs and resolve are reinforced. Batman Begins asks the question of who is Batman, while The Dark Knight asks, can you endure what it takes to be Batman? As for The Dark Knight Rises, it raises one final question. Is there an end for Batman? Just like Batman Begins, this film was another examination of the man behind the mask, and much of this film was in service of Bruce answering that final question. And this makes for some of the most compelling scenes in the trilogy. More than any other film so far, this is the one where Bale gets to really shine as Bruce Wayne, and he goes above and beyond in capturing Bruce's sorrow, rage, and triumph. But having said that, Bruce himself is a bit of a double-edged sword, and it gets into a recurring issue with the trilogy: Nolan's portrayal of Batman. Nolan's Batman is defined by his anger and grief. And while that's a good starting point, there's always been more to Batman than that. Compassion, empathy, hope, heroism, traits like that are just as important as rage and trauma. And it's not like this version of Batman is devoid of those qualities. Nolan's Batman is an idealist at heart, and he has those brief moments where you can see empathy and compassion come through. But those qualities are often very understated, and the films never explore those traits as often as things like his trauma and sadness. And while that seems like a really minor thing to critique, minor things like that are what get people invested in a character. Batman is a superhero, and while things like backstory and character growth are very important, it's also the little things that get fans invested in a superhero. While I love the action and detective work of a good Batman story, I often think about many smaller moments as well, like a father giving advice to a son, or an adult comforting a child on the verge of death. And the reason I keep bringing up this issue is because more than any other film in the trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises relies on your investment in the character. Bruce Wayne's journey is the emotional core of this movie, and if you aren't invested in this journey, a huge aspect of this film won't resonate with you. And even though the trilogy gives you many reasons to be invested, I'm not sure if it's enough, especially when you look at what this version of Batman lacks. For example, Nolan's Batman only has a handful of relationships, and because of that, we don't get to see many sides to his personality. The most we get to seeing a unique side of Bruce is with Rachel, and like, come on, she's no Andrea Beaumont. And in addition, this Batman is far from the world's greatest detective, as most of his detective skills involve punching things into a computer and letting the computer do all the work. Batman's detective skills are there, but again, they're very understated compared to his other qualities. And to top it all off, not only was Batman sidelined for an entire movie, but his most heroic qualities were either understated or effectively null and void by the time of Rises. I firmly believe the ending of The Dark Knight was one of Bruce's shining moments, and it's in that moment where he shows an indomitable will and the resolve to keep fighting no matter how hard it gets. Then by the time of Rises, you find out that he in fact did not have the resolve to keep going. And even though Bruce goes through a distinct arc across the trilogy, the arc in question is essentially various permutations of being sad and angry. I know it's a massive oversimplification, but it's not entirely inaccurate either. But the point I'm trying to make is that this Batman is missing a lot that could really add to his character. More characterization is never a bad thing, and that goes a long way to getting an audience invested. And I say all this as someone who, to reiterate, still likes this version of Batman in spite of his issues. For me, there's still enough there that makes him a compelling character, and because I'm invested in this Batman, many parts of Rises still resonate with me. But like always, that is just one person's perspective, and your investment in Nolan's Batman will come down to your preferences. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight aren't as reliant on your investment in Bruce Wayne, and even if you were neutral or indifferent to the character, there was almost always something else to keep you engaged. But with Rises, neutrality and indifference might not be enough. A character study doesn't mean anything if you aren't at least a little invested, and while there's more to Rises than just Bruce Wayne, it's still a central aspect of this film. But in any case, most of the first act revolves around establishing various characters and plot threads, which includes everything from Bruce's mental state to the cogs of Bane's master plan. Everything culminates in Bruce coming out of retirement and his first encounter with Bane, and for all this movie's faults, the first Bane fight is one of the best in the trilogy. While the choreography and camera work is still average at best, there's something haunting about the lack of music and the sounds of Bruce getting picked apart piece by piece. It's easily the best fight in the movie, and a contender for the best in the Nolan trilogy. But of course, the battle doesn't end well for Bruce, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. Bruce's defeat signals the beginning of the second act, and with it, the full reveal of Bane's master plan. Bane reveals that like Ra's al Ghul before him, he intends to destroy Gotham once and for all. A nuclear bomb is set to go off in 5 months, and even though Bane explains that Gotham has a chance to stop the explosion, it's ultimately a lie designed to give the citizens of Gotham the illusion of hope. And the second act is a good branching point to discuss everyone's favorite Harley Quinn character, Bane. All in all, Bane is a pretty good villain. Bruce hasn't had a physical equal since Ra's, and Bane functions as both a physical superior and an intellectual equal. That said, there are a handful of issues with Bane, one of which we'll come back to later. As for another issue,
I'm sorry, we are out of apple pie.
That's Bane.
Is that with a Coke to drink?
I feel like Ryan is like a Sean Connery and
Sorry.
the novel is definitely Bane.
Could you repeat yourself?
but besides his dorky voice, the more pressing issue with Bane lies in his writing, or specifically, the way his plans play out. Bane is the main driving force of the film, and as such, it's where you can see a lot of the issues with the film's writing. But to summarize, Bane's plans are as follows. Kidnap nuclear physicist Dr. Pavel, have a member of Bruce Wayne's board, John Daggett, use Selina Kyle to steal Bruce Wayne's fingerprints, use said fingerprints to drain Bruce of his money, defeat Batman and steal his equipment, turn Bruce's fusion reactor into a nuclear bomb, reveal the bomb to Gotham to throw the city into a frenzy, and hold the city hostage while the core slowly decays over 5 months, trap Gotham's police force underground, sit back and watch Gotham slowly tear itself apart, then lastly, kill Batman. And when you look at Bane's entire plan, it comes off as really complicated, and for no particular reason either. Parts of Bane's plan don't serve much of a purpose, and even if they do, it's equal parts convoluted and contrived. For example, the entire subplot with the stock exchange boils down to Bane ordering Daggett ordering Selina to steal Bruce's prints. It's debatable whether this is part of Bane's plan or more Daggett's plan, but from a story standpoint, this subplot doesn't really matter. Bruce is honestly barely inconvenienced by being broke, and if you cut this entire storyline, the core film doesn't change very much. If the film really wanted to include this subplot, why not just cut out Daggett and have Selina report directly to Bane? Or better yet, why not use another character, especially one who serves as a love interest and a member of the Wayne board? It just seems pointless to add more characters to this subplot, especially when it barely matters in the first place. But in any case, I hope I made my point clear. If Bane's plan was limited to defeating Bruce, turning the reactor into a bomb, and holding Gotham hostage, most of the film plays out in a similar way. Things like the stock exchange and trapping the cops underground are really superfluous additions, and if anything, their inclusion just weakens the whole script. And there's nothing wrong with complicated plot threads either. I like a complicated plot as much as the next person. After all, many of the Joker's plans were just as complicated as Bane's, and they were often a mix of predictions, gambles, and improvisation. If you told me the Joker was high on spice and could see the future, I'd believe you, because a lot of his plans only work when everything plays out in a very specific manner. My man had to basically play 5D chess and make insane reads, and it makes the Dark Knight feel really contrived at times. But as complicated and convoluted as the Joker's schemes are, they're easy to look past because they add to the story of the film. While the Joker is obviously very intelligent, his more defining quality is his chaotic nature, and much of the Dark Knight revolves around Bruce, Gordon, and Dent trying to keep up with the Joker. The Joker's antics add tension and chaos to the story, and because of that, it's easy to forgive any narrative missteps. But in the case of Bane, his complicated plans don't add much to the overall story. In essence, a lot of Bane's plans amount to complex methods to achieve simple goals, and while parts of his plans make perfect sense, others are borderline nonsensical. Complicated writing isn't a shortcut for intelligent writing, and instead of coming off as a carefully crafted, meticulous plan, Bane's plan just comes off as ridiculous, and it makes Bane come off as ridiculous as well, assuming it's still Bane's plan and not someone else's. And in spite of all that, I still like Bane overall. He's on the exact line between being silly and threatening, but he also gets some of the rawest lines in the trilogy, and I do think his positives outweigh the negatives. As for the next part of the film itself, the second act of Rises is split between two halves, with one half centered on Bruce, and the other focused on the secondary characters. And while the second act is an improvement in terms of pacing, it also highlights an issue I alluded to earlier. Just like the first act, some of the best parts of the second act are when it's focused on Bruce. By this point, he's been broken physically and mentally, and he needs to find that inner fire to not only keep fighting, but find a reason to live. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it makes for some of the best scenes in the trilogy. Everything culminates in Bruce climbing out of a physical and emotional pit. And even though the metaphor is as subtle as a brick to the face, I can't help but love a scene that shows the triumph of the human spirit. However, Bruce's scenes are only one part of the film. While Bruce is fighting for his life, the other characters are scrambling to deal with Bane's takeover, and it's not always very engaging. As for Selina Kyle, let's start with the positives. Anne Hathaway does a solid job as Catwoman, and she brings just the right amount of sass and intelligence you'd expect from the character. But the issues with Selina lie less in Hathaway's performance and more with the writing. In Rises, Selina is more or less a hired hand, with her eventual goal being a device that would allow her to erase her identity and begin a new life. She's a former thief who wants to start over, and that's her main driving force throughout the film. But the problem is that Selina just isn't very relevant for most of the movie. She stops being relevant after the first act, as she doesn't have a personal stake in Bane's plan or the state of Gotham. She's more concerned with getting what she needs and getting out. And I recognize that's the intent behind her character, since she's meant to be a bystander who later redeems herself. But a side effect of this is that it makes Selina feel unnecessary, and if you cut her out and give her plot contributions to say, Tate or Blake, the film plays out in an identical way. And all of this leaves Selina as a forgettable addition to the film. Hathaway does a good job with the material she's given, but from a writing standpoint, Selina just doesn't have much going for her. She's not very involved in the main story, her relationship with Bruce is poorly developed, and while she does have a distinct character arc, there's only so much screen time to go around. Honestly, she feels designed for one purpose, which is something we'll get to later. And it's really frustrating because Selina isn't a bad character in theory. Many of her scenes are really good, and she's a breath of fresh air with regards to female characters in the trilogy. But the writing behind her doesn't do her justice, and she's yet another example of bloat within the film. And speaking of more relevant side characters, the second act also focuses on Detective John Blake, as he investigates the new state of Gotham. And cards on the table, I really hate this character. I admit most of this is fairly irrational, and if I'm being honest with myself, Blake isn't that bad of a character. If anything, he's one of the stronger characters in the film. But part of the reason I hate this character is because of what he represents in the broader mythos, the Robins. While the details and dynamic differ depending on the Robin in question, every Robin acts as both a unique character and an extension of Bruce's character. When written effectively, Robins can showcase different aspects of Bruce, like Bruce as a father figure, a mentor, or a failure. But Robin's perception in pop culture is a bit of a mixed bag. When most people think of Robin, they probably think of things like this.
Holy oleo. Holy astringent plum-like fruit. Holy contributing to the delinquency of minors.
Or this.
Rubber lips are immune to your charms.
And while general audiences and pop culture is one thing, it's another thing when studios, writers, and directors share this perception. To this day, most live-action Batman films seem deathly afraid of including a proper Robin, and there's no better example of this than John Blake. Blake is best described as the poor man's Bruce Wayne, as the two share similar ideals and goals. But that's about the most you can say about his personality, because other than his basic traits, he barely has a personality. He's less of a character, and more like an exposition bot and plot device. And in spite of what I just said, there are aspects to Blake I don't mind. I don't mind that he figures out Batman's identity because he sees part of himself in Bruce, and I don't mind how his character grows throughout the film. But every time I see this character, I just feel immensely disappointed. Blake is barely even Batman's sidekick, he's honestly just some guy, and I just wish there was more to this character beyond that. Blake is arguably the third most important character in the film, as he is the most involved in the story after Bruce and Bane. And to top it all off, he's this trilogy's version of Robin. And if you're going to include a Robin adjacent character and make them so important, at least have the courtesy to do the concept justice. And I'm not saying Blake should have done spandex and start throwing hands, that's insane. But at the very least, I want a Robin character to embody the spirit of being Robin. A film like Rises is the perfect vehicle for a character like Robin, or to be more specific, Robin as an expression of Bruce Wayne's character. The film already establishes that Blake and Bruce have similar ideals and trauma, and you could do so much with that idea, like Bruce as a mentor figure, or Bruce learning to trust someone beyond his inner circle. More than anything, I just wish there was more to this version of Robin. As it stands, John Blake is such a nothing character, and he could have been so much more. But getting back to the rest of the movie, the third act begins around when Bruce returns to Gotham, and honestly, there isn't that much to say about it. The final act is split between side characters finishing their respective jobs, and the battle between Batman and Bane's forces, but none of it is very engaging to watch. The peanut gallery scenes aren't anything to write home about, and the final battle sequence is a huge visual clustercluck. Even the highlight of the battle, Batman's final showdown with Bane, is such a letdown compared to the earlier fight. Not only is the choreography somehow worse, but Batman's master plan boils down to punching Bane in the mouth. And I'm sorry, but that's lame as hell. I recognize that this Batman isn't as hyper-intelligent as other versions, but having the final battle be a glorified gimmick boss is a massive disappointment, especially when the film did such a good job with their earlier fight. And the cherry on top is the final reveal of the film, which is that Miranda Tate was actually Talia al Ghul, a reveal that probably surprises nobody. And before getting into the negatives, I'll start off by saying I don't mind Talia for this film, at least in theory. In the years leading to this film's release, my friends and I would often talk about who the next main villain should be, and I was always an advocate for Talia al Ghul. Her character just fit in the Nolan trilogy so well, and the idea of her being a direct parallel to Bruce offered a lot of storytelling potential. So fast forward to the film's release, and the final result is less than stellar. The main issues with Talia are twofold. She's barely a character for most of the film, and even when she becomes a real character, it's already too late. There are hints for a true character, but she's really just a sorry excuse for a love interest for most of the film. I know the bar for being a love interest wasn't exactly high, but I didn't expect to see a worse love interest than Rachel of all characters. And it's really disappointing, because in theory, Talia has everything she needs to be a great villain. She has a really compelling motivation, and you know Marion Cotillard can do a great job if she's given better material. But the most Talia amounts to is a huge bait and switch. Talia al Ghul doesn't add to the story, and if anything, she actually weakens it. With the reveal that Talia is a real mastermind, everything about Bane becomes so underwhelming. Bane was just following orders, and the big imposing main villain winds up being another henchman. You'd think Nolan would have learned from history. I've been mentioning how large parts of this film can be trimmed, and Talia is the most egregious example. She either needed to be cut or retooled in a way that used her more effectively, and there's like a dozen ways to do so. The film could have revealed her true role earlier, given her stronger characterization, or even merged her character with Selina's. Surely anything's better than getting shoehorned in at the 11th hour, and then dying in one of the most embarrassing death scenes of all time. And following Talia's demise, the film moves into its final sequence. And for all of this movie's faults, I do think the ending is really strong. Batman as a character doesn't really have an end, and the idea of Batman dying, but Bruce Wayne living on is a good ending for this version of the character. But even though I like the ending of Rises always felt, for lack of a better term, reverse engineered. To me, it always felt as if Nolan and the team settled on the final act first, and wrote the film around that. I know that sounds weird, but think about it. What was the point of the cops being trapped underground? That entire plotline is really contrived, even for a comic book film. But as you see later on, the reason for this plotline is to give the final act a massive, climactic battle. Or at least, it was an attempt to do so. And on a similar note, what was the point of Bruce's energy reactor? It's a pretty strange plot point, and the other characters mention how stupid and dangerous it was in the first place. But as you see by the end, the reactor was meant to play a role in Bruce's sacrifice. And lastly, why include characters like Selina Kyle, John Blake, and Talia al Ghul? Not only do they have paper-thin characterization, but they're some of the biggest contributions to the film's bloat. And of course, the answer lies in the ending. Talia was meant to represent a potential future for Bruce, but it only ends up being a false hope. On the other hand, Selina was meant to show us that Bruce has moved on and found someone to share a future with. And lastly, everything about Blake, from his origin to his character arc, was in direct service of the ending. John Blake was tailor-made to be the next protector of Gotham and the successor to Batman's legacy. Now, I'm not saying the entire finale feels artificial, and I'd like to give Nolan and the team a bit more credit than that. And there's nothing wrong with writing something backwards either. God knows how many of my scripts start like that. But so many parts of the final act feel designed and predetermined, even if it came at the expense of the writing. The plot feels nonsensical at times because it was all needed for this exact ending, and all the characters were included because Bruce needed 2 love interests and a successor. And the really frustrating part is that if the film narrowed its focus just a little bit, there could have been something really amazing. For example, if you focused the film on just Talia and Bruce, you could write a really compelling story about shared trauma, love, and grief. Or, if you revise the film to focus on Bruce and Blake, you can make a story about Bruce becoming a mentor and learning what it means to create a lasting legacy. Some of the best Batman stories of all time are great examples of those very ideas, and I really wish Rises could stand alongside those stories. But with The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan and Warner Brothers tried to have their cake and eat it too, which resulted in this bloated mess of a film. And I want to express that as critical as I've been with this movie, I don't hate it. I think it's physically impossible for me to hate this movie no matter how much I try. You don't gamble your college admissions on something unless you really love it, and I still have many fond memories related to this movie. This was one of the first movies I went to a midnight premiere for, and I still remember getting into debates with friends about the Nolan trilogy. I once argued that it was better than Lord of the Rings, and looking back, I can't believe how insane that sounds. But to make a long story shorter, I did genuinely love this movie at one point, and even though my perception of the film changed over time, make no mistake, I've had my gripes with Rises ever since day one. I always hated the time skip, I always hated John Blake, and so on and so forth. On some level, I always knew this movie was flawed, and I think it just took time for me to stop trying to outsmart the truth and just let it have its day. And in spite of all that, there are moments in the film that still resonate with me, almost as much as they did years ago. The Dark Knight Rises is far, far from unwatchable, and as time's gone on, it might have actually gotten better. DC films have been, let's say, very mixed in the years after Rises, and many Marvel films don't fare much better. But I shouldn't have to reiterate just how messy this film is. And even though I think the Bruce Wayne scenes are good, they're only one part of the film. And if you're someone who isn't invested in Bruce's journey, what else is there to be invested in? There are hints of a genuine masterpiece in Rises, but that's all there are. Hints. While my personal ranking of the trilogy used to be different at one point, my revised ranking should come as no surprise given the tone of this video. I personally think Rises is the weakest film in the Nolan trilogy, and while it does have some of the trilogy's best moments, it also has some of the worst. And if you're someone who genuinely loves this movie, I completely understand. It's always fine to enjoy something in spite of any flaws, and a movie like this one is no exception. And in spite of its many shortcomings, I appreciate that Rises tried to be an emotional, character-focused Batman film. Every Batman story will have some good parts and weak spots, and the most we can do is acknowledge those flaws and hope future stories can learn from past mistakes.